Ryan's Office Revenge.
I knew something was seriously wrong when Danny Walsh started hovering around HR like a vulture circling roadkill. The guy wasn't subtle about it either. He'd lean over Linda Parker's desk just long enough to accidentally catch a glimpse of someone's compensation package, then whistle under his breath. Wow, didn't realize we were carrying this much dead weight in legacy positions. Legacy. That's what he called those of us who'd been around longer than his MBA degree was old. Named Scott Morrison, by the way. 47 years old, been with this company for 22 years as a senior systems architect. Built half the infrastructure these young hotshots take for granted every day. My wife Sarah always tells people I'm the guy who makes sure their emails don't disappear into cyberspace and their paychecks hit their bank accounts on time. She's not wrong. I wasn't surprised when I caught Danny in the server logs late one night, 11:23 p.m., pulling metadata on employment classifications. My name was right there in his search history. So was the clause I knew he'd choke on if he ever bothered reading past the executive summary. Section 6. B. A little piece of contract gold I'd negotiated back in 2018 when nobody cared what back-end engineers were entitled to, as long as the servers stayed up and the client stayed happy. I never bragged about it, never even mentioned it to Sarah. But I kept my copies. The PDF, the original signed document, and a notarized backup on my personal drive. You don't survive 2 decades in corporate America without keeping your paperwork straight. Learned that lesson early when I watched good people get screwed over because they trusted handshake deals and verbal promises. Danny strutted around our floor like he owned the building, the people, and the profit margins. Would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. Half his revolutionary restructuring ideas were recycled proposals I'd written 4 years ago when I suggested a dynamic deployment model that could cut rollout delays by 35%. He dismissed it then as too conservative for our growth trajectory. Now he slapped a fancy new label on it, Adaptive Integration Framework, and presented it to the board like he'd invented electricity. I didn't say a word, didn't need to, but I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Every time he talked about optimizing human resources, his eyes lingered just a little too long on the senior staff section. Not the junior developers fresh out of college, not the eager millennials with their standing desks and kombucha. Us. The ones who remembered when this company actually gave a damn about its people instead of treating them like line items on a spreadsheet. The thing is, Danny didn't understand how deep I was embedded in the system. He saw systems architect on my title and figured it meant I wrote code all day like some glorified programmer. What he didn't realize was that my scripts didn't just manage functions, they managed entire operational states, including client-specific parameter tuning that required absolute SLA continuity. Pull me out, and the dominoes wouldn't just fall. They'd crash into legal, client services, and federal compliance because 3 of our major accounts were defense contractors. I'd signed ND as so classified they came with their own security briefings and annual polygraph tests. It would have been impressive if it wasn't so stupid. Danny thought he was hunting inefficiency. What he was really doing was poking a live electrical wire with a metal fork while standing in a puddle of water. I could tell he'd started asking HR about inactive contract renewals when he began that whistling routine. Linda would look uncomfortable every time he lingered near her desk, shifting papers around like she was hiding something. He thought he'd found a shortcut to trimming payroll. Thought mine was one of the dead branches ready for pruning. There was just one problem with his one brilliant plan. Our legal team wasn't run by complete idiots. At least one paralegal, Jerry Brooks, had been around long enough to remember when I personally flagged the visibility issues with our internal contract portal back in 2018. That clause Danny was pretending he hadn't seen, it had teeth, real ones. If HR failed to issue an updated contract by the specified date, and if I didn't receive formal notification of any renewal delay or suppression, my entire equity package would vest immediately. All of it, retroactively. No appeals, no negotiations, no corporate lawyer magic tricks to make it disappear. But here's the thing that Danny couldn't wrap his MBA brain around. I never wanted it to come to this. I didn't hate the company. Hell, I liked the work, even enjoyed some of the controlled chaos that comes with keeping complex systems running. I had friends here, people I'd trained, projects I was proud of. Sarah and I had talked about maybe sticking around another 10 years, then retiring with a nice pension and some dignity intact. But Danny turned what should have been a professional partnership into a personal crusade. He looked at my quiet professionalism and saw weakness. He looked at my age and saw obsolescence. He looked at my salary on that spreadsheet and thought, easy target, old guy who won't fight back. That was his first mistake. The second was thinking experience meant expendable. All I had to do was wait and let him hang himself with his own rope. Then Linda asked me at the company dinner if I'd received my contract renewal. She smiled that friendly HR smile. We sent it last week. Danny said he'd deliver it personally. I set down my fork real careful-like. So I guess he didn't mention why he held on to it. The second quarter kicked off with that thick, artificial tension you get when management starts floating words like efficiency review and talent optimization. I didn't need a memo to smell what was cooking. Danny had started using his favorite phrase in every meeting, value recalibration. Said it with that MBA smirk like he'd trademarked the concept. You could feel him calculating the moment he started mapping out who built what and how fast it could be handed off to cheaper contractors or AI automation tools. The man had spreadsheets for everything. Productivity metrics, salary comparisons, even bathroom break frequency. I'm not kidding about that last one. Carol Hayes from Client Operations told me he'd actually asked facilities management for badge swipe data to track non-productive time allocation. Then came the whispers. Carol mentioned that Danny had asked how much of our back-end codebase could, theoretically, be transitioned to external teams with lower overhead costs. Not if it could be done. How soon? The question itself told me everything I needed to know about where his mind was headed. I was polite when I asked her to forward me that email thread. She hesitated, then did it. The word legacy appeared 4 times, twice in bold. Danny was building a case, document by document, meeting by meeting, for why the old guard needed to be cleared out to make room for his vision of a leaner, more agile organization. Same day, legal pinged me on Slack. Nothing dramatic, just a soft inquiry from Barry Foster. Hey Scott, can you confirm whether Section 6B is tied to your current role classification or functional output metrics? Innocent on the surface, but legal doesn't go fishing in contract clauses without someone holding the other end of the line. And nobody prompts legal unless they're setting up a clean termination process. I'd seen this dance before with other companies. First comes the legal review, then the performance improvement plan nobody's expected to actually complete, then the mutual separation agreement that's about as mutual as a mugging. So I spent my weekend going through my employment file line by line. Every word, every comma, every addendum and attachment. Sarah brought me coffee and asked what had me so buried in paperwork. Just checking on something, I told her. Didn't want to worry her until I knew exactly what we were dealing with. The retention clause wasn't just active. It had been re-verified during our last acquisition review in 2021. Not only that, but the automatic vesting multiplier had increased again due to a 5-year milestone Danny clearly hadn't bothered calculating. The numbers were bigger than I'd remembered. A lot bigger. It wasn't buried in fine print. It was right there in black and white on page 12 of my contract, with additional clarification in Addendum C. He just hadn't done his homework. Typical MBA move. Make decisions based on assumptions instead of facts. Monday morning, I passed him in the hallway. He had that spreadsheet swagger, earbuds in, probably listening to some podcast about scaling leadership through disruption. He nodded like I wasn't standing 3 feet from his professional grave. I kept my tone even. You looking to restructure the system side? He blinked, pulling out one earbud like I was interrupting something important. Not personally, he said, all polished and rehearsed. But yes, we're evaluating legacy positions. Nothing's finalized yet. There it was again, legacy. Like we were expired milk in the back of the corporate fridge. I gave him a polite nod. Just make sure HR stays in the loop on timeline issues. Of course, he said, distracted, already putting the earbud back in. Section 6B needs proper acknowledgement for any role transitions. That got his attention. His head tilted just enough to show I'd touched something he didn't quite understand. You could practically see the wheels turning as he tried to place where he'd heard that before. You mean that old retention clause? Exactly. There was a flicker in his eyes, like he remembered seeing the clause but couldn't place why it mattered. I didn't explain. Let him dig. Let him think. Let him wonder why the dinosaur was bringing up contract details instead of just rolling over and playing dead like he expected. He had no idea I'd already printed backup copies of the clause, highlighted the key sections, and dropped them with my lawyer over the weekend. Wasn't being paranoid, was being prepared. That's the difference between experience and ambition. One writes strategy papers, the other reads the actual contract and understands what the words mean. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure ramped up. Danny started scheduling one-on-one meetings with senior staff members. Career planning sessions, he called them. But word got around fast about what they really were. Susan Torres came out of hers looking like she'd been hit by a truck. Barry Foster was so rattled he took a sick day the next morning. They weren't firing people outright. They were making life miserable enough that folks would quit on their own. Classic corporate strategy. Create a hostile environment, document every minor issue, then act surprised when people can't take it anymore and leave voluntarily. Saves money on severance and unemployment claims. But I wasn't some junior programmer they could intimidate into submission. I'd been around long enough to see this playbook used before, and I knew something Danny didn't. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. You just have to be patient enough to let them walk into the trap they're building for themselves. Danny thought he was cutting fat from the org chart, but what these hotshot VPs never understand is that some of those legacy positions are actually load-bearing walls. You rip them out thinking you're renovating and the whole building comes down on your head. But sure, let's recalibrate. Let's talk about value. I could wait, because by the time they figured out what Danny had missed, the damage would already be done. And there wouldn't be a single Slack thread or strategy meeting that could stop it. The company dinner was at some overpriced steakhouse downtown, the kind of place where the wine costs more than most people's car payments and the atmosphere feels like a tax write-off. Danny held court at the far end of the private dining room, telling some story about predictive analytics and customer journey optimization, winning hearts and minds like he was running for office. Meanwhile, I sat 2 seats down from Linda Parker, nursing a club soda and watching Danny perform his quarterly leadership theater. My contract renewal still hadn't arrived, but I had. Sarah had ironed my good shirt and told me to play nice with the corporate children. She always knew how to make me smile, even when I was stressed about work. The table buzzed with the usual corporate small talk, Q3 projections, client updates, whose kid made varsity soccer. I found myself thinking about my own son Tommy, who was finishing his junior year at State. Engineering major, just like his old man. Smart kid, but he'd grown up in a different world than I did. One where job security wasn't guaranteed and loyalty was a one-way street. Linda leaned toward me with that friendly smile managers practice in the mirror. She'd always been decent to work with, even if she had to toe the company line. "So, did you get your contract renewal yet?" she asked, casual as commenting on the weather. "We sent it last week," she continued before I could answer. "Danny said he'd hand-deliver it personally." That was the moment, the fulcrum. I could have smiled, could have shrugged it off, made some joke about interdepartmental mail being slower than carrier pigeons. Instead, I set my fork down gentle and deliberate, like I was about to say grace. "So I guess he didn't tell you why he kept it." Silence. Real silence. Not the polite pause between networking conversations, but the kind that scrapes a room raw and leaves everyone feeling exposed. Linda's smile didn't just fade, it evaporated like it had been vacuum sealed off her face. The guy next to her, some middle manager from procurement, stopped mid-sentence about his fantasy football league. Across the table, Danny's jaw locked. Just one quick twitch, but I caught it like he'd bitten into something rotten and couldn't spit it out in front of the board liaison sitting 3 chairs down. I didn't raise my voice, didn't stand up or make a scene. I just reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a folded envelope, and placed it carefully between the dessert menus. Cream-colored paper, blue ink signature, dated and time-stamped with a notary seal. "I won't be renewing," I said, effective immediately. I didn't need to drop a microphone. The envelope did that for me. Danny reached for his wine glass, then thought better of it. Too late for liquid courage, too early for damage control. And the worst part for him, he still didn't know what I'd just set in motion. Not yet. But Linda did. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes darted to Danny. Then back to me, then to the envelope like it was ticking. You could feel the air pressure change in the room. Someone coughed. Someone else reached for a dinner roll like that would make everything normal again. The head of product development, a sharp guy named Tony Miller who'd always treated me with respect, quietly pushed his chair back an inch. Smart man, getting clear of the blast radius. The room didn't explode. It imploded. Danny cleared his throat, forced a tight smile that looked like it hurt his face to maintain. "Let's not be dramatic here," he said, trying to regain control of the narrative. I looked at him and answered flat as day-old beer. "I'm not being dramatic. That's your specialty." Then I went back to cutting my steak. 1 bite, 2 bites. The meat was perfectly cooked, expensive as hell, and I was determined to enjoy every dollar of it on the company's dime. Nobody else picked up their forks. There's a kind of power in staying calm when everyone else is losing their minds. Makes people realize they're standing in the middle of a train wreck too late to jump clear. Linda was the first to speak again, her voice careful and professional. "Scott, maybe we should schedule a meeting to discuss this properly." "Nothing to discuss," I said, taking another bite. "Everything's documented. Legal has copies." Danny's face went a shade paler. "Legal? What does legal have to do with anything?" I dabbed my mouth with the cloth napkin, taking my time. Section 6B, Contract Suppression Clause. You might want to read the fine print before your next efficiency review. And that's when I saw it, the exact moment Danny realized he'd stepped on a landmine. His eyes went wide, then narrow, like he was trying to remember something important he'd forgotten. The color drained from his face as the implications started sinking in. Tony Miller, bless him, broke the tension with a quiet chuckle. "Sounds like someone didn't do their homework." The rest of the dinner was a masterpiece of awkward small talk and forced smiles. People picked at their food, made excuses to check their phones, and generally acted like they were attending a wake, which in a way they were. Danny's career was about to be declared dead, and mine was getting a very expensive resurrection. When the evening finally limped to its merciful end, I shook hands with everyone like nothing had happened. Professional to the last. Linda whispered that she'd call me in the morning, and I told her to route everything through legal from now on. Danny avoided eye contact entirely, probably already calculating how much damage control he'd need to do. I walked to my car feeling lighter than I had in months, not because I was happy to leave the company, I wasn't, but because I'd finally stopped pretending that loyalty and hard work were enough to protect you in the modern corporate world. Sometimes you have to read the fine print and use it to protect yourself. Sarah was waiting up when I got home, wanting to know how dinner went. I told her it was interesting and that we'd probably have some big changes coming soon. She knew me well enough not to push for details when I wasn't ready to talk. But I had a feeling that by morning, everyone would know exactly what Section 6B meant. And Danny Walsh was about to get a very expensive education in the importance of reading contracts before you try to screw people over. By 8:15 the next morning, my security badge was deactivated. Not by them, by me. No farewell email, no Slack goodbye messages, no tearful desk-clearing ceremony. Just a clean server-side logout and a pre-scheduled auto-reply. This mailbox is no longer monitored. Quiet as a whisper and twice as final. Danny didn't notice until his morning sync meeting. He asked Susan Torres from DevOps why the overnight patches hadn't deployed. She said, because Scott's scripts are version locked, and he didn't leave the deployment keys. He waved it off. "We'll figure it out." Then legal showed up. 2 suits from compliance knocked on his office door before lunch, folders in hand, expressions tighter than budget projections. One of them, Roy Hamilton, I think, had a sticky note on the front of his packet. All it said was 6B confirmed. Danny actually laughed when he read it, like it was some kind of office prank. That old clause? Come on. That was before the last restructuring. No way that still applies. Roy didn't laugh back. It's still binding. The renewal packet was never formally amended. Danny's smile evaporated like morning dew. But he didn't give proper notice. He didn't need to. You suppressed delivery of his contract update. That counts as non-renewal without documented notification. Danny leaned back in his ergonomic chair like someone had punched him through the mesh. He's bluffing. There's no way he can prove anything. But I could. Because back in 2018, when nobody was paying attention to retention clauses for senior engineers, especially US older guys, they'd given me leverage in the form of a fallback equity trigger, Section 6. B. If a contract update is suppressed, delayed, or not delivered with proper documentation, all stock grants, performance bonuses, and milestone equity investments convert to immediate payout. The value? $12.5 million. Not in maybe someday performance incentives. Real money. Liquid assets. Cut the check and wire the funds kind of money. Danny muttered. He can't prove I didn't deliver it. Linda answered from his doorway. She'd been standing there the whole time, pale as copy paper. Actually, he can. He asked me directly at the dinner, in front of 12 witnesses. Danny opened his mouth, then realized there was nothing to say. Not when half the leadership team remembered exactly how I'd phrased the question. Not when HR remembered. Not when 2 board members had been sitting at the same table, probably already calling their lawyers, to make sure the company wouldn't face additional liability. He slumped in his chair. Fine. So it's enforceable. Can't we negotiate? Cap the payout somehow? Roy shook his head. The clause doesn't include mitigation language. You missed the compliance window. Danny snapped. This is insane. We can't just hand over $12 million because of some paperwork technicality. Roy replied, tired but resigned. It's not a technicality. It's a contract. You're the one who chose not to read it. Outside that office, the whispers started again. Only this time, they weren't wondering if layoffs were coming. They were wondering what else Danny had screwed up. What other legal landmines he'd stepped on while playing corporate warrior. Word travels fast when a company suddenly discovers they can't function without the legacy systems they'd been planning to eliminate. I wasn't there to hear any of it. I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop across town, laptop open, reviewing 3 job offers that had appeared in my inbox overnight. News travels fast in our industry, especially when a major company suddenly realizes their entire back-end infrastructure is held together by one guy they just let walk out the door. Within a week, the CFO looked like he'd aged 10 years and been living on nothing but antacids and regret. Our biggest client, Dataflow Industries, paused their expansion project. Their CTO sent a direct email that probably made every executive's blood pressure spike. Who's managing Scott Morrison's optimization protocols for the Phase 3 rollout? There was no good answer. The truth was, nobody knew how. The tuning algorithms I'd built weren't just back-end code. They were adaptive systems tied to real-time logistics and SLA-based constraint resolution. You couldn't just hand that off to a contractor, not unless you wanted 2 weeks of service outages and breach penalties that would make Danny's $12 million mistake look like pocket change. Danny tried anyway. He hired a consulting firm from Austin to reverse engineer my systems. They delivered their assessment 72 hours later. Non-modular architecture, high dependency on undocumented variable interactions. Recommend complete rebuild. Timeline, 18 to 24 months. Budget estimate, 8 to 15 million. Translation. Good luck with that, buddy. 4 days in, another client froze their contract renewal. Same problem, same silence from our end. Then came the internal email that started the real avalanche, a thread from sales accidentally sent to the entire operations team. If Morrison's out, are we renegotiating deployment SLAs across the board? Nobody replied. Because the second someone answered that question honestly, the house of cards became a liability report, the kind that gets flagged by investors and attached to quarterly forecasts like a scarlet letter. Meanwhile, I was fielding calls from competitors who'd been watching the situation unfold like spectators at a controlled demolition. Strat. Edge Labs didn't even need to interview me. Their CTO opened our first conversation with, "We've been studying your constraint management framework for years. When can you start?" They offered equity, autonomy, and a team of engineers who actually wanted to learn from experience instead of replacing it. I signed the same day Danny's company triggered the automated payout process for Section 6B. $12.5 million, wired to my account in 3 business days, plus the satisfaction of watching a smug MBA learn that some lessons can't be taught in business school. Sarah and I celebrated quietly that night. No fancy dinner, no champagne. Just the 2 of us on our back porch, talking about Tommy's college fund being fully covered and maybe taking that trip to Ireland we'd been putting off for years. Sometimes the best victories are the ones you don't have to shout about. Danny got reassigned to strategic initiatives, corporate speak for professional exile with a desk and a meaningless title. Last I heard, he was managing vendor procurement processes. Seemed about right for someone who thought people were as disposable as office supplies. You can't automate experience. You can't outsource institutional knowledge. And you definitely can't bully someone into retirement when they've spent 22 years reading the fine print you were too arrogant to notice. As for me, I'm doing just fine. Building systems that actually matter. Working with people who understand that wisdom doesn't come with an expiration date. And every morning when I check my account balance, I'm reminded that sometimes the best revenge is just letting someone hang themselves with their own rope. You just have to be patient enough to hand them the noose. In corporate America, they'll tell you experience doesn't matter until the day their systems crash and they realize all that legacy knowledge was the only thing keeping the lights on. The best contracts aren't the ones that make you rich. They're the ones that make you untouchable when someone decides you're too old, too expensive, or too inconvenient to keep around.